Hey guys, it's Jake here with Etrailer. Today we have a 2018 Grand Design Momentum triple axle toy hauler, and we're going to be taking a look at, and I'm going to show you how to install the MORryde CRE 3000 Equalizer Upgrade Kit. Now from the factory, this trailer did have an upgraded Equalizer kit. It was the Equa-Flex from Lippert, and it's a great kit. They wear out over time. This trailer's 6 years old, and it had some wet bolts and some dry bolts. You don't need to absolutely have a wet bolt in every one of these connections if you do not have a moving part. With a triple axle trailer, we have all of these parts are moving, so we really do need all wet bolts. We use the MORryde Shackle Upgrade Kit for triple axle trailers side by side with this CRE 3000 kit, and it works out perfect because all of our bolts get replaced with wet bolts. And you will get bronze bushings for every single one of the connections on the ends of our leaf springs. The nylon bushings that come from the factory inside a leaf spring, I personally think are junk because this is what happens after maybe a year and a half of use. With this trailer being a 20,000 pound trailer, that's the max GVWR. This is an incredible amount of weight put down on top of these bushings, and we were having quite a bit of slop in that Equa-Flex system. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily the Equa-Flex the fault of that. It's just that nylon bushings wear out. So when I had the axles free hanging like this, I could move that system and feel the slop in it. Whereas this is nice and tight now. All of our bushings are replaced with bronze bushings, and all of our bolts are wet bolts. When you upgrade to an equalizer like this, you are going to get, for this specific kit, you're going to get up and down movement, which you can see the slot right here. Gives you a lot more travel when you're going over hitting bumps on the highway. And you're also going to have the shock absorption on either side. So instead of your traditional equalizer, which is just your steel triangle that goes in the middle, you're going to have your front axle will hit a bump, it'll shock through this equalizer, dampen it before it even gets to the next axle. After all, that's how equalizers work. They're designed to equal out the amount of pressure put on the axle. So when you hit a bump with the first axle, it pushes on to the second axle. That axle pushes into the ground, pushing that front axle back into the ground. So it kind of goes back and forth. With an upgraded kit like this, you will see some improvement with chucking too, or porpoising. When you're trying to get on the highway or you're hitting a series of bumps on the highway, you'll feel that forward and backward motion when you're driving down the road. This is going to help with that. I've had this kit on my personal trailer. I just had the tandem axle kit on there. But it really does help a lot. It helps to settle those axles down, because if you have the traditional equalizer, like I said, it's just steel. It's leaf springs attached to a steel triangle. That's all it is. So when you're headed down the road and you hit a bump, the first axle hits it, throws it into the second one throws it back to the first, and that's where you get that porpoising, because those axles are working back and forth. When you have this shock absorption in the middle, that's going to help to dampen that. This kit is going to include 4 equalizers, 2 to go between axles number 1 and 2, and then 2 to go between axles number 2 and 3. You'll notice that the rear equalizer will look like your traditional style equalizer, whereas the front set is going to look like a traditional for a triple axle trailer. This kit is designed to fit axles that have a spacing from the center of axle to the center of the axle up to 35 inches. And it's going to be rated for axles that are up to 8,000 pounds. Now when it comes to the equalizers themselves, they are going to be a maintenance-free equalizer. You don't have to do anything to the rubber bumpers in there. They are designed to last for a very, very long time. The wet bolts, however, we get a lot of questions about how often do I need to grease those wet bolts. Well, if it was my trailer, I used to grease mine twice a year. I didn't go on a whole lot of trips, maybe 10 trips a year, just weekend trips. I would do it at the beginning of the season and then right in the middle of the season. And that way I knew that my wet bolts were always good. It may be a good idea, like maybe once every 2 years, to replace the wet bolts, just so that you can get nice clean wet bolts so that they're working good for a long time. Now, as far as the installation goes for this particular kit I would say it's not a particularly difficult install, it's just time consuming. The one thing I will say is if you have hydraulic jacks, it will help you a lot. Just lift up the one side of your trailer, do one side at a time. Do not try to lift the whole thing up in the air and do both sides. You will need 2 floor jacks too to be able to lift up 2 axles at the same time. That will help you to adjust them in order to get this hardware in a lot easier. And then whenever you're done with axles number 1 and 2, or between axles number 1 and 2, you'll take that first jack, move it around to the back, and then you can do the equalizer between axle number 2 and 3. A good rule of thumb, if you go to take these parts apart and the eyes of your leaf spring are worn through or worn out because your bushings were shot, most of our bushings were still kind of holding on, but they were getting close. If we'd have put another couple of thousand miles on it, it would have not been good, and we would have had to put all new leaf springs on too. A good rule of thumb is that if you can slide this bronze bushing in from this kit into the eye of the leaf spring without having to pound it in, it's probably, it's time to get a new leaf spring. So just keep that in mind, but also keep in mind that when doing stuff like this, we run into it all the time. If you're doing an installation like this, you may run into stuff that needs to be replaced along the way. So just keep that in mind, keep an open mindset, and just take your time with the installation. But with that being said, let's go ahead and show you how we did it. To begin our installation, we're gonna need to remove our old equalizers. These equalizers are essentially pretty close to the same thing as this, so it's pretty easy to denote where we're gonna have to put each of these components. We have our taller hanger here, so this will match up to this, and then our standard equalizer will go towards the rear. That is gonna be the case with all of your toy haulers, or your triple axle toy haulers, because they want this extra flex up here in the front. Take all of our hardware off, get this equalizer removed. If you're using a series of jacks like we are, I highly recommend it. It makes it super easy to get these out. As you'll notice, I will just slide this out with my hand. There's no need to beat it out with a hammer. And we've got these jacks, we got one under each of our axles. You really only have to do the 2 axles at a time. Just have 2 jacks. If you have 2 floor jacks, that works just fine. But put one under each, and then you can raise and lower it to make it easier to take the tension off this hardware. Some of these are going to be pressed in on the other side, so just take a hammer and tap it out. The reason we got to beat some of these out is because they got splines on the back side that are biting into it. If you have the ones that rotate on the shackles, they do not have splines. That's why you can pull them straight out. Now what we need to do is knock these nylon bushings out, replace them with our bronze bushings, because we're going to have wet bolts, and you can't use wet bolts with these nylon bushings. Now we're using a tool we use around the shop all the time here. It's just an air hammer or an air chisel, and what you want to do is just get that nice and clean. This is exactly why we do not like nylon bushings. They wear through the bottom, and then it starts wearing through the leaf spring itself. So get those pushed out. You can use a screwdriver too. Just tap on it with a hammer and bust that out. To get your new brass bushings in place, I don't recommend hitting it with a hammer on this edge because you'll flare it out and it won't fit right in here. Take this bolt that came out of the top of the equalizer, slide it on. The reason I say that bolt is because it does not have a greaser on it. We'll tap it in place. And once you bottom out the head of the bolt, take your hammer and pop that bolt back out. And it's always perfectly flush with the end of our leaf spring. Now we can lift our new equalizer up into place. I'm just gonna slide it over our leaf spring here so that we got it pretty close to lined up. And what we're gonna have to do is from the back side, those splines that we were talking about earlier, we're gonna have to take a socket and beat that bolt into place so that the splines bite into the steel. Another thing I'd like to point out before we tap this into place is you see this little hole, that's where the grease is going to come out. So you want your hole to be facing either 9 o'clock or 3 o'clock, so either direction. You do not want it on the bottom. The top is okay too, but if you put it on the bottom like this, the chances of you being able to push grease out of that is very low. So because you got all the weight of the trailer resting on it. We're just going to take I'm using an 8 or a 10 millimeter socket for a 1/2 inch drive, and we're just going to tap this. You want to go over top of that grease zerk. Now we're going to put our new shackle in place. And this is what I'm talking about. See, I'm just spinning this jack, and you can make such finite movements with this jack in order to get it lined up so that it slides right into place. Take the other shackle, slide it over, make sure it goes over those 2 collars, and follow it up with a nut on each one of them. We'll also want to take a nut and put it on the outside of our center bolt here. For this bolt here, we'll do the same thing. I'm just gonna pull back on our axle. Now we're going to take a 3/4 inch socket and a 13/16 wrench and snug these up. Do not run these down as tight as you can. We are going to have to come back and torque them to the specifications and the instructions, because this whole operation here needs to be able to move a little bit. So you don't want to crank it down to 200 foot-pounds. You want to torque it down to the right torque spec. While you're doing these equalizers, I highly recommend just replacing all the bolts. The kit that we're using today is going to come with all new wet bolts for everything, so that's what I'm doing right here. Now we're going to repeat that same process on the rear equalizer. The only difference here is that we're going to have 2 shackles rather than just the one on the front and then the single bolt. So we'll just have to do that same process. Once you get all your hardware out, just lift your equalizer up. Beat that into place and then get all this attached. Once you get all of your hardware in place, we're going to take a torque wrench and torque all of it to the specifications and the instructions. Then you want to come back with a grease gun and add a little bit of grease to each one of these. After watching that installation process, if you don't feel comfortable doing this yourself, there is no harm to that. Check out our dealer locator on our website, and it'll take you to the nearest dealer closest to you to help you get this kit installed. Well guys, once you get everything greased up, all you need to do is put your wheels and tires back on your rig and you're ready to go. Hopefully this video helped you decide whether or not the MORryde CRE 3000 Equalizer Kit for your triple axle trailers is right for you and your trailer.